Talking about 1.6, describing angle pairs. The first angle pair I want to talk about are complementary angle pairs. And complementary angles, it's two angles that are going to add up to 90 degrees. Okay, 90-degree angle is also called a right angle. Okay. So you can also see two angles that add up to a right angle. Okay. Supplementary angles are two angles. When you add them up, they equal 180 degrees. Okay, so if this was 120 and this was 60, they add up to 180, and so they are supplementary angles. A neat way that I like to tell the difference between them is when you actually look at the words. Okay. If you look at the complementary, if you look at the C and the O, if you draw a line straight down and you put a little degree mark, you can see that they add up to 90 degrees. Also, the same thing for supplementary. If you look at the S and you fill it in like an 8, and then you make the O a 0, or the U a 0, and then you put a 1 in front, supplementary angles add up to 180. Another angle pair are adjacent angles. So I like to think of those angles as right next to each other. Okay. Adjacent angles share a common vertex. And they also share a side. So you can see that these angles are right next to each other. And they also don't overlap. So you don't see an angle, this blue angle, and then you see this red angle here. Those are not adjacent angles. Those are just overlapping angles. So we're going to try an example. It says, in the figure, name a pair of complementary angles and a pair of supplementary angles and a pair of adjacent angles. Okay, so let's start with the complementary angles. Okay, well, we need two angles that are going to add up to 90 degrees. Okay, so I know 127 is not going to work because it's bigger than 90. But if I take a look at 37 and 53, if I add those together, then I get 90 degrees. Okay, so those are actually my two angles that are complementary. So angle CAB and angle RST are complementary. Now we want to name a pair of supplementary angles. If I look at 127 and 53, if I add them together, I get 180. So since I know that those two add together to equal 180, they must be supplementary. Okay, so angle CAD and angle RST are supplementary. And on the last one, we need to name a pair of adjacent angles, so that means that they're right next to each other. Okay. As you can see, that BAC and CAD, they are right next to each other. So those are my adjacent angles. So angle BAC and angle CAD are adjacent. Alright, the next vocab words we're going to talk about are a linear pair and vertical angles. Okay, a linear pair, when you have two angles and they form a line, you'll see this line here. When they form a line and they also add up to 180 degrees, they're going to be called a linear pair. If you take a look at the word linear, it actually has the word line in the word. So you can kind of think of that as, okay, these two angles are going to form a line. Okay. The formal definition is two adjacent angles are a linear pair when their non-common sides are opposite rays. Okay, so opposite rays means they have a common endpoint and they point in opposite directions. And the angle is a linear pair. They are supplementary, so that means they add up to 180 degrees. Okay. Vertical angles, they are formed by two intersecting lines. And they're not going to be the angles that are right next to each other because those are adjacent angles, but they are going to be across from each other. So if we look at the picture 3 and 6, they are across from each other, and so they are vertical angles. Okay. Also, if we have 4 and 5, those are also across from each other, and so they are also vertical angles. Vertical angles are also congruent, so that's just one thing that you need to remember. So let's try an example real quick. It says identify all the linear pairs and vertical angles in the figure. Okay, so we want two angles that add up to 180 degrees. That means they form a straight line. Okay, and that are a linear pair. So if I look here, okay, I can see if I look at the bottom, 4 and 5 form a linear pair. So I'm going to make a column. So linear pair. And we're going to put vertical angles to the side. Okay, so I'm going to say angle 4 and angle 5. Okay, and we need to see if there's another linear pair, so I'm going to erase this real quick. And if I cover up 2, 3, and 5, we can see that 1 and 4 actually form a line. And they are indeed supplementary. So we're going to say angle 1 and angle 4. And we just want two angles that are actually adding up to 180. So we could not say 1, 2, and 3 are a linear pair because that's 3. And pair means that we only have two angles. Alright, let's look at vertical angles. Sorry, that looks like an R. Let's make that a C. There we go. Okay, so vertical angles, we have two intersecting lines, and they're going to be angles across from each other. So if I take a look at these two intersecting lines, and I kind of ignore that extra line, I see that 1 and 5 are across from each other. So angle 1 and angle 5 are vertical angles. Now, angle 4, if 2 and 3 were one angle, then that could be a vertical angle pair, but we have 3 angles that are being involved, so they cannot be classified as vertical angle pairs. Okay, so the only vertical angles on there are 1 and 5. To end this video, I just want to recap what we learned. We learned about complementary angles, and we know that we have two angles that add up to 90 degrees. Okay. Then we also talked about supplementary angles, and we know that they add up to 180 degrees. The next thing we talked about were linear pairs. Adjacent angles and then linear pairs. And adjacent angles are angles that are right next to each other. So here's an example. So angle 1 and angle 2 are adjacent. We have a linear pair, and that's two angles that form a line, and they add up to 180 degrees. So we have angle 1 plus angle 2 equals 180. And the last one we talked about were vertical angles. And that's when we have two intersecting lines and we have the angles that are across from each other. So 1 and 3 are vertical angles, and then 2 and 4. And that's all you need to know for 1.6, and you will be going over more examples in class.